Marc Fennell, how are you, mate?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good. I'm really curious to talk to you today because your brain fascinates me, your career fascinates me, and in the best way.
Okay, good. I'm glad you specified that. I feel like you're about to do experiments on my brain.
Yeah, no,
So that's why you brought the scalpel into the studio.
Yeah, that's why. But I'm really curious as to, you've built a career off the back of curiosity and telling the stories of moments in time and people who have been pivotal parts of those moments. I wonder, what do you think history will say about this moment that we're living in right now?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think right now we're living through a really tumultuous period in history where we've probably... I can't think of a time in my lifetime where we've trusted each other less, right? So I think one of the fun parts about my job is I get to travel the world and I get to talk to people from the US to Egypt to the UK and all over the place. And it's the favourite part of my job, which is that I get to meet people that I wouldn't ordinarily get to meet, and I get to, by nature of my job, is I'm professionally curious. It's my job to... You don't just walk into a place and do small talk. You walk in and you have to go from hello to let's have a deep and meaningful conversation. One of the interesting things about that is that you do get... You sort of... you skip over the niceties and you get to, hey, what's wrong here? Like, what do you want to change about wherever it is you live, whether it's like an island off the coast of Canada or part of Australia. And what I have noticed consistently over the last 2 years is a level of distrust. And I think the internet is a part of that. I think it's never been easier to distrust each other. It's never been easier to distrust what you see. And it's never been easier for us to disagree with each other. So I think my suspicion is that when history looks back on this particular moment, it will regard it as a time of high contention, which is rare for people to realise it as I think you're living through it.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to recognise that. And because the only way we get out of it is if we find better ways to communicate with each other.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's an incredible point. And I wonder, you said there about we're more disagreeable. It's easier to find ways to be more disagreeable. But I don't know if we've ever respected each other less in disagreement.
Yes, and that's a really good point. I think, partly why it's gotten worse is that we do fundamentally respect each other less, or people we disagree with, we respect less. And I think we have started to culturally retreat to people that only agree with us. And I think it's understandable, when, depending on the issues at stake, right? When there are things that people can disagree with that are existential, there's a group of people that disagree I should even exist. And I think it's an understandable reaction for people to retreat to safe spaces, right? And I understand why people do it. It isn't necessarily, I'm not saying it's necessarily an altogether bad thing, but it's a hard thing to get out of. If we're constantly retreating back to people we only ever agree with and we're not stepping out and starting a conversation with somebody who, at least on the face of it, disagrees with you about something, we're never going to get out of this problem. There's no pathway out of it if we don't actively try and put ourselves in situations where we create a dialogue with people that we disagree with. And I'm always struck by, the really fun part about my job is that I have to go to places where I don't belong. I have to go to places where I shouldn't really be there. And you have a license to, because you've got a microphone, you've got a story you're working on, you've got a film you're working on. And I love learning. The only reason for me to do any job, whether it's a podcast series or a television documentary series, the only reason for me to do anything is if there's a chance I might learn something. And I think most people in kind of journalism or creative careers, you should be driven fundamentally by love of making, love of making a story, love of making a thing, but also what are you going to learn? What by the end of today, what are you going to know that you didn't know at the beginning when you woke up? I think it's a great way to live your life. It doesn't always work. And sometimes you learn, I did the wrong thing and I shouldn't have done that. That's still a lesson though. And I think it's 100%. A worthwhile one.
I think it's interesting what you said there about when we get caught in just this existence within the groups who think like we do. I think groupthink can be really dangerous. If you can't independently think, you're in dangerous territory because you're on a path that ultimately only leads in one direction. The direction of what everyone else thinks it should.
Yeah, and I think Look, I agree with it. I also think we lose a bit of a... it's funny, like, I think you lose the ability to create, like, critically interrogate things if you're just sort of going with a singular orthodoxy around any idea. And it's hard because we're sort of talking in, like, really general terms because you kind of have to, because it's a different case for everybody. Everyone's got their different issues, right? But I sort of think if you don't learn to question, if you don't learn to critically engage anything, then you kind of stagnate. You don't really move. And I think that's, again, like, it's just dangerous to be in a position where you can't ask questions.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so interesting that I think there's a level of fear around asking questions, because a lot of people do so in those social settings where if they ask the wrong question, even if they don't know it's the wrong question, even if they're trying to learn, if it's just a product of curiosity, there is a fear that if I ask the wrong question and somebody hears, somebody observes that, then I'm potentially going to be outcast.
Yeah. I think this is where intention counts for a lot, right? I think there's asking a question because you want to needle somebody, or you want to get a reaction, or you want to show somebody up, or you want to catch somebody out. Like, and then there's asking a question because you genuinely want to know, or you genuinely don't know, or you want to learn. I think we, as a culture, need to think beyond what people are saying and more to find out, well, what do people mean when they're saying that? We've come out of a period where, people are afraid to ask questions about certain things for fear of being, as you say, outcast. I think we're going to be a lot better off if we look for people's intention. Like, well, hold on, why are they asking? Are they asking because they genuinely want to know, or they genuinely don't know, or they want to learn or understand my perspective? I think we should be a bit more gracious in those moments.
The internet's not great at providing context, though, is it?
Pardon me. No, it's not. The internet doesn't do nuance well.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, it's funny because it doesn't, right? Like, I think, I always used to say that I think Twitter in particular kind of rewarded the worst of us. Like, it rewards like this fast twitch muscle response where it's like whoever says the fastest, funniest, snarkiest, meanest thing wins. And that's it. I think it's kind of trained us to a certain kind of interaction. And you can see that filter into Facebook and Instagram and TikTok comments. But at the same time, this is also internet, right? It's also given birth to longer form conversations and live conversations where actually there is space for nuance. It's just that when those bits sometimes get taken out and lifted out, they tend to mean something differently. So, yeah, the internet, it's hard to talk about it in aggregate because it is a whole range of different forms of communication. But I do think the faster response forms of internet, so like your Twitters and Facebooks and whatnot, I think they've probably encouraged us to be the worst we can be, which I suppose is a bit controversial, but it's
an interesting point, and I love what you say about the short form of it, because I agree with you. There's often people I'll listen to on a podcast and I'll think I fundamentally disagree with what I've seen from them in short form, but in long form I can kind of see the intent is good. And that's that key word you said, like the intent behind it, the actual heart of it. And I think it's really valuable to think about this in the term of the short. And most people, I'd say relatively most people would consume just short form on the internet, be it Instagram, TikTok, and it gets shorter and shorter as our attention spans shrink.
Yeah, totally.
But I heard this question the other day that someone asked on a Q&A show. And the question was, is society cooked? And I love that question, right? And then I reframed it and went, is society cooked, or are we just spending too much time on the internet? Because I think on the internet, you can be fooled to think that the loud minority on one topic is the consensus of, majority of the population, but it's not always the case. I genuinely think there's a distasteful, let's say just any group, let's speak very generally, any distasteful minority that are very loud about something that seems to feel wrong and doesn't feel right and makes us question whether society is cooked or not. When you actually walk out onto the street, it takes you 10 minutes to walk past someone who gives you a smile or says g'day or steps out of the way or holds a door for you to remember that man, society's generally really good.
I mean, look, it probably depends on where people live and what your experiences is, but I tend to think you're right. I don't... Yeah, I do think if you're an extremely online person, you're likely to find as much joy as you are dislike in that environment, because otherwise you wouldn't be there all the time. It can't all just be the dopamine hit of, you know, scrolling on something. But I do think it doesn't leave a lot of room for the social niceties. It doesn't leave a lot of room for grace.
Yeah.
Look, maybe that's a solvable problem. Like, maybe that is something that if we, you know, if we're more sorry, I sound like bloody Oprah. If we're more intentional about how we talk to people online, maybe we can change that. But yeah, like, I think the loud minority thing is really interesting, because sometimes the minority is loud for a reason. They're loud because their issues have been ignored by, you know, traditional print media for a long time, and the internet has provided an environment for them to be heard on whatever that issue is. So there's a bit of interplay there. But there is also a side effect of that, which is there's a whole bunch of people that are not actively engaged in that issue that are probably looking at it going, why has this suddenly become a big deal, right? And I think it's an ecosystem. Like, internet is an ecosystem. And the ramifications of one person yelling are that some person gets, you know, might change their mind. It might make them see an issue differently. There'll be a bunch of people that recoil and go, I don't want anything to do with that, because it just seems like that's where the angry people live. Both of these things, you know, doesn't make it necessarily inherently good or bad. It just means that you have to acknowledge that people are going to see that scream and acknowledge it differently.
For sure. I think that's a really sound point, and I think it's probably, you know, there are plenty of... It's funny because I tend to say that I'm a pretty optimistic person. Like, I've always taken the view of you can be anything, be positive.
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
Find positives in the world around you, in your situation, in your circumstances. Like, look for the positive, and usually positive things follow. I think when you look for positive, you tend to show up in the world in a pretty kind way.
I agree.
I would say that's like pretty general, right? But then I often think I can't help but feel like the more time I spend on the internet, the more pessimistic I become sometimes, because I think the one thing about the internet I love, where there's like the minorities who stand for the good, but I think sometimes we forget to take that and apply it to real world situations. And I think sometimes that's where the missing link is. Like, everyone can be loud on social media because there's nothing at stake. There's a great point, without diving too political, but I think it's great to touch on at the moment, is, you know, the violence against women issue that we've got in Australia, which has been inherent for a long time. And there's a bunch of things that need to change for that to change. And culturally is one part of it. Bail laws, all this sort of stuff is another part. Without diving too deeply into an issue that I don't particularly understand the politics of, but I would say that I understand the heart of it, is that we need to do a better job as men.
Yeah.
And we need to do a better job in policing this kind of behaviour. And I would say that it's so loud online and it's easy to support something, but when real life stakes apply, like you're a bloke in the street and you see someone being mistreated by another man, if you're going to speak online, you need to be able to then exist in a place where you call it out.
Do you reckon we're at a stage where people will? Like, what I'm kind of intrigued about now is the stuff that we need to do as a culture, we have been told repeatedly for a decade now. What's happening now is that we've had a series of truly horrific events. The nation has been, attention has been focused. Do you reckon now we've moved culturally to a point where what you're saying will actually happen? That just because somebody saw it online, they will actually change their behaviour in real life?
I would like to think so, and maybe that's my optimistic view on the world. I think, there's a great question that's been asked of many women and men on the other side at the moment. If your child was left in the forest with a bear or a man, which one would you prefer and which one would make you feel less comfortable? And it seems that there's a lot of women who say they'd feel more comfortable about the bear. And that shocks me as a man, but it shocks me as a man who exists in a circle of really good men. Because I think about my partner who I love dearly, and I think about any woman that I've ever cared about, and I know that any man in my life, and I can genuinely say this because I know them well and I've seen them exist in their families and their circles, and I've seen them exist in tough situations where there has been stuff at stake, and I believe they represent a really good part of the population. And so for me, I look through optimistic eyes and I go, well, if it was my child or my partner lost in the forest and that man was one of the men that I know, heart to heart, he'd help her. But that's obviously not a portion of the population. And so I think what needs to change for me, put the politics aside and the policing and all of that, put that to the side because that's an issue for someone who's qualified in that space. But I think culturally what needs to change is a lot of men are really fearful of being, that word again, outcast from the group. So if something happens at the pub and you're in a group of 10 guys, 5 guys, 3 guys, whatever it is, and your mate says something that you know
It's a bit cool.
that doesn't sit right.
Yeah.
That makes me feel uncomfortable. And you know if it does because you feel that, you know, like that tough swallow and there's like that thing in your gut that goes, that ain't it. You've got to have the confidence to say, fuck, mate, what are you doing? You're better than that. And I think it's a language. And I had this conversation with 2 of my best mates who come on the podcast maybe once every 2 months. All come from very different backgrounds, all have had very different upbringings. And I love chatting to them because they're genuinely good guys. We pull each other up on things, we challenge each other. And we had this conversation and I was really surprised by the statistics. And not the recent statistics, but the stats that come out last year around 1 in 3 women have been either emotionally, violently or sexually abused by a partner. Well, not by a partner, sorry, by a man. And I was like, that doesn't mean that 1 in 3 men are abusers. It just means that we've got a population, whatever that is, of people who continue to offend. And so why is this happening, right? And I was like, why am I so shocked by this? And I'm shocked because I exist in a group of good people. But I'm like, we can't just go, well, let's... And this is the hard part, right? We can put a portion of these men behind bars who commit physical acts, the emotional abuse, and so sexual and violence, put them away. They need to learn a lesson, right? The emotional thing, it's harder to police, right? So how do we call out the emotional abuse? How do we call out that behaviour? You need to have the confidence that if you're outcast from that group of people, they're not a good group of people to be in.
Yeah.
If you get outcast because you've said something that heart to heart you know is right and is in the good of in the interest of being a good person, it's not the kind of friendship group that you want to exist in. And there's many ways to meet better people in today's society. But I think it's about how do we actually change those people? Because otherwise it's a slippery slope. Emotional abuse today could lead to physical or sexual abuse because you obviously don't respect the people that you're hurting, right? And so how do we change that? And that's the hard thing because we've got to try and reform this behaviour. Otherwise, it can continue on a really bad path.
Be interesting to see what shifts out of our culture coming out of this. I don't know the answer. I wish I did. And as you say, there are people who no doubt are more qualified than us that have been probably screaming about this for years, and hopefully now we're paying more attention. But just for me, I am curious to see if we can acquire the language and the toolkit to communicate with each other to change that behaviour before it calcifies into emotional, physical or sexual abuse. I know that this isn't necessarily a thing that can be purely solved with cultural prevention. There's obviously other things, and you mentioned policing and things that and you know, law reform that needs to come into the picture, and that is outside my area of expertise. But it would be really interesting to see if this moment provides an opportunity for us to talk to boys and men and give them the toolkits early so that some of these issues don't arise. I don't know if we're at that point, but I'd be interested to see if that is what comes out of the next couple of months.
I just think men need good role models, as do women. Women need good role models. We all do. It's part of having something to look to strive to be like, is to be like people who represent good in the world. But I know for certain one of the things that a lot of men struggle with, and I think I heard one fella say it, I don't know who it was, but I thought it was a brilliant point. he said men who don't know how to articulate how they feel often turn to their aggression.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, isn't it?
You know, and so how do we teach men how to communicate better?
Yeah.
To voice what they're feeling. And because I don't think that there is a small cohort of people who are born not well in the mind, but I think most kids are, you know, brought into the world pretty pure, but they're moulded by the environment around them. And so how do we set up their environments to teach them how to communicate, to set good examples? I think it's all a part of the process, and it's definitely not going to be a let's solve this tomorrow. It's going to be a let's put plans into place to make sure that, firstly, women feel more safe in the environment of the world, especially in a country like Australia. Mate, we live in such a beautiful country. We're so lucky.
Yeah.
It's, you know, we can definitely make change here, and that's where my optimistic comes in. There's so much good in the world. Let's just amplify it.
Yeah.
I'd like to think it's that easy, but
who can? I mean, it's the right attitude to take that we can build upon what works, and problems are solvable. Like pardon me, I do hold it as this weird article of faith that all problems are solvable. Some more complicated and layered than others, but I do just on a fundamental level believe that every problem is solvable. It just depends on our understanding of the problem that we're solving, at our level of commitment, and how capable are we of building a coalition of people who are capable of solving that problem in all the different ways it needs to be solved. You know, when we talk about policing and law reform and believing people and giving men in particular languages for how to communicate their emotions early so that perhaps some of these issues don't develop. I choose to believe that they are solvable, but it's clear that whatever we've been doing to this point hasn't solved it yet.
No, correct. Well, that was chapter 1 of the podcast. How to solve life's problems.
Yeah.
No, I joke, but I'm really, one of the things I'm really curious, I want to come back to you for a moment. We've touched on it a few times, is curiosity, which is essentially the genesis of everything you're doing from a career perspective. Where do you think that comes from?
That's a good question. Let me have a think about that. I realised in high school, I was the kid that people came to talk to about their problems. And I probably should have... I think at some point I probably assumed I was going to do something like psych instead of the weird career that I've ended up having. But I remember, like, really early on, like, I was that kid that was on the, you know, the kid that's like on the side of a bunch of groups. You know, like in high school, you got like a bunch of groups, and I was always like off to the side of a bunch of different.
Wanderer.
Yeah, kind of. And I was never like, you know how like some cliques are like really tight. I was never in that. I was always like slightly off to the side of a bunch of different groups. Like always like not like full blown outsider, but just like always on the periphery. It meant that you could move around different social groupings as well, which was kind of useful. But what I did realise very early on was like when people had problems, I'd always be the one that you'd end up in a D&M with. And yeah, and I guess it probably, I didn't twig at the time, but I like listening. And I like just trying to understand people, and I like creating a space where people feel comfortable sharing who they are, feeling unjudged. And also just, one of the other things is like as you get older, just a recognition that I don't really know that much. Like when I was younger, I'm like, I know a little bit about everything. I'm an expert. No, mate, you don't know anything about anything. And as you get older, you become hyper aware of all the things you don't know, which some people find disempowering. I find it, I just view it as an opportunity, because every day you don't know something, that means there's something out there to be discovered, right? So that, I think curiosity is it's just a great prism through which to approach everything. I don't know how to make a TV show. I don't know how to do this. Well, let's find out how we get there. Let's learn. I don't know anything about football. I don't know anything about wine. I don't know. Let's go. Let's ask some people and let's learn. It's just a great way to experience the world through questions. It sounds the problem I have is when I describe it, it sounds really lame.
No, it makes sense to me. It really does. Because I would say I'm not exactly that way inclined, but I've found that I've become far more empathetical and I've become far more curious by leaning into conversations with incredibly different people who have different worldviews and have had different experiences. Like I had the most amazing upbringing, like so loving, full of joy, happiness. Like it was picture perfect. Couldn't have written a better childhood. Like it's a feel-good movie, 10 out of 10, 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, you know? And then you sort of get to a point where you're like, you almost get to a point where you're an adult and you just assume that everyone grew up the way that you did. and I didn't show up in the world in a way that was that lacked empathy or lacked kindness. But I was almost just like naive enough to think that everyone just existed with the same love, care and attention that I did.
Yeah, that must have been quite a shock when you realised that was not everyone's experience.
A major shock, you know? And you kind of like, I remember speaking to people on the podcast who had severe drug addictions.
Yeah. And
you're like, I always used to think, maybe I lacked a little bit of empathy here. How do you get yourself into that situation? And then you hear someone speak to you about their abusive childhood and the challenges and the lack of love and the lack of support. And you're like, well, actually, I kind of can, even though it's wrong and it hurt you and you wish you didn't go down that road.
You understand.
I can understand now. And so I get what you mean, like that curiosity for me has become almost like an addiction.
Yeah.
I want to know. And as I've found myself learning more, I remember being on a family trip. My family take the piss out of me for this all the time. I was with my dad and my sister. We were in Italy. And any time we went out on like a day tour trip, I would like, they had this thing by the end of the trip where they'd go, question for you, because I'd always pop up in the middle of a conversation with someone from the other side of the world and go, question for you, and fire something at them, because I was just naturally curious.
Yeah.
And I think when you've existed in a world that looks very similar to yours from all aspects, and then you're an adult and you're in the big wide world, I think it's hard not to be curious.
When you were growing up, did you realise that did you have an appreciation that you were living the 100% on Rotten Tomatoes happy existence? Like, did you know that at the time?
100%. That's
amazing, because most kids don't. Most kids don't realise it later when they're like, shit, my upbringing was really good compared to, you know. That's good that you could appreciate it in real time.
There's a great, I don't know if you'd call it a quote, but there's a great story that I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard similar, something along the lines of hard life, strong... Fuck, I always fuck this one up. It's something along the lines of...
And you're building up to it too.
Yeah,
I was like, he's going to say something
He's going to nail it.
I wanted this on a Hallmark card.
Me and Dua Buckley struggled with this one because we were trying to connect on it over a pod one time, and we both just absolutely butchered it, more so me than Dill. It's like, easy times create weak men create hard times create strong men create easy times. It's like this cycle, right? And I think I look at my childhood and I'm like, my childhood was so good, and I was so privileged and so blessed and so taken care of. I very easily could have been a brat. And I don't mean that we weren't given everything we asked for. Like there was a level of discipline, there was a level of respect. Like we really respected like our parents and our grandparents, but we just had a great upbringing. And I think, that had all the ingredients for me to have been like a little bit of a brat, or even like incredibly naive in thinking that the world just hands you everything on a silver platter. It's just like a very upper middle class upbringing, I guess you'd describe it as. Went to a great school, like a small private school, and, just like so many brilliant things in my life. But I think the thing that made me so grateful and appreciative, because I'd almost say that is one of my strongest virtues, is my health challenges.
Yeah.
Because when you immediately recognise that, hold on, I'm so well, and everyone else who's my age who has this condition, or at least 90% of them, are very sick and in hospital all year. And it's these two people, my mum and dad, that are the reason at this age I'm so well. And so I had so much gratitude, oceans of gratitude for them and for the opportunity to live a really healthy, blessed life, that I think it was almost that bled into all of us. It made us the people we are. I FaceTime my dad and my mum. I'm not joking, Mark. I'm 28. I speak to them on FaceTime minimum 2, most of the time 3 times a day. Like I do.
You
a
make
morning
the rest
check-in.
of us look bad, all right?
Yeah.
Put it away.
Yeah. Couple mums and dads listening to this going,
Yeah, mine. My mum will be like, you only text me when you want childcare.
Yeah. But I think it's like, it's true. It's how you bring, like for me, I grew up in a world where I was like, so blessed. But then naturally when you step out of it and you realise it's different on the outside, you become curious about those things.
Yeah.
So that curiosity for you has ultimately created and forged an incredible career. How do you find an idea and then have, I guess, how do you have the, let's call it consistency, let's call it discipline is probably the better word,
to turn it into
stick
something.
with that idea?
So I make lots of different kinds of things. I make TV shows and documentaries and podcasts, and sometimes I'm the one that comes up with the idea. Sometimes somebody else is the one that comes up with the idea. Sometimes it's working together in a team about it. So there's different comprising. For the ideas that I come up with, you can tell pretty quickly if it's going to live or die. So a good example of that is I did a series, a podcast series that I did for Audible last year, that came out last year, called The House of Skulls. And it's about in a basement in a university in America, for some reason, there is a classroom lined with thousands of human skulls. And what happened was I was interviewing somebody else. I was interviewing a priest for some other show. And he casually mentioned that one day he got a call from an American university, and they're like, "Hey, we've got a Tasmanian skull. What do you guys want us to do with it?" And I'm like, "Sorry, what?" And he's like, "Yeah. Well, apparently there's this room in America filled with human skulls." And I remember in that one moment, I was like, "What is this thing? Like, why does this exist?" And it's the bubbling up of questions. We're like, why? Who did this? What was the point of it? What were they trying to do? And as soon as I got off the phone with that guy, I do what I call vortexing. So I get sucked into it. And I basically spent 2 hours reading everything I could, and I just bashed out, this is what I think it is, this is where I think we go, this is where I think the story is, blah, blah. And I didn't know what it was. It was like, it's a podcast, it's a book, it's a TV show. I don't know, it's a thing, it's a story. And I just blah. And I look like Keyboard Cat while I'm doing it. You know, in that, like, the most important thing is when you are excited about an idea or curious or confused or enraged, whatever, harness it. You take that you need to find out now. You take that and you harness it. Don't put it away. Don't go, I'll look at that tonight after coffee. No. Do it then. Because that in that moment is when all of the ideas you'll ever have will kind of explode in front of you. So when you hit that moment of excitement, just if you can, like, it's not always possible. Sometimes you're like, I still got to drop the kids. You're doing other things. But if you can, harness it in the moment, because you will never, ever be more excited about that thing than in that moment. It also means that in a year's time, when you're still working on that idea and you're no longer excited about it, you will have captured everything you need to, all the questions that you need to answer, you will have captured in the first moment. So, that project, I first had that, vortex moment in 2021. It was like in the middle of one of the pandemic lockdowns, right? It didn't come out until 2023. Like, that's a long ass arc between when you have an idea and when it actually happens. And, throughout all that, there's moments of like, is this thing ever going to be done? We're going to finish it. And, we had like restrictions on when we could go and talk to people because of, it was during the pandemic. But because in that moment I had crystallized everything I wanted to do with it and everything that I was excited about and everything I was confused about, I always had something to come back to. So for me, another big thing is writing it down. I have no memory. Like, my memory is, you can ask anybody that knows me, I have the worst memory. I cannot remember shit. But if I write, which is why I write everything down. Like, but different people are different. One of my best mates, Corin, he's a writer-director on a lot of the films I make. He has the most astonishing memory. And I'm just like, how do you, they're like as a one conversation you had with somebody 2 years ago. How do you remember that? Kills me. Meanwhile, I need to write it down. But once you've written it down, that is excitement on a piece of paper. And when something's long and it goes forever to get something made, you can always come back to that document and go, yes, that is why this was worth doing. So the short answer to it, sorry, I'm a rambler. The short answer to it is when you're excited about something or when something happens to you, harness it and get it down on paper, because there will come a time when it is boring to you and you'll want to remind yourself why it was exciting in the first place.
I often think about people like yourself, people like me who have the ability to do this, and I think we're blessed in a way that we get to lean into passion a little bit more than maybe some people allow themselves to. I think like these days, not many people have little passions outside of their work.
I've been lucky that I managed to turn my weird passions into a job. Not everyone gets a chance to do that. But, pardon me, I've been lucky that I got to turn my passions into work. But at the same time, like, there's other things that I get fascinated by that have nothing to do with my job. Like, I love the challenge of, like, coming up with a meal that my kids will actually eat. I can't turn it into content, but it's like...
TikTok.
Yeah, I know, there's probably... I won't do that. But, like, and it's not, it's not a glamorous challenge, but I like it.
Yeah.
I like coming up with things that my kids will eat for dinner. So it doesn't, I think, I got slightly distracted, sorry. I think the thing is that you're right, it is an incredible privilege to be able to take your passion and be able to turn it into something that somebody pays you for. And I'm very, very lucky in that regard. I think what people don't see is the sheer amount of stuff that you get excited about and you try. And what people don't see is all the shit that hits the wall and goes nowhere. And I think it's important to talk about, right? Because I think I'm in this weird position where I have a lot of stuff that comes out in a year. I have a bunch of different TV shows and podcasts that come out in a year, and people just assume that everything I do gets made. It's like, no. There's like 20, 30 ideas a year that go nowhere. But you have to do it. You have to and at the same level of excitement, the same this is going to be a winner. This is a great idea. And it goes nowhere and it hits a wall, and then you're like, oh. But you file it away. It's always there. And then at some point in a couple of years' time, maybe circumstances change or a piece of information falls into place, and then suddenly be ready to go. And so always, when you're excited, bank it. Take advantage of it, bank it, because maybe it's the right idea for the wrong moment. Maybe it's the right idea for different reasons. Maybe it's not a thing that's going to make money. Maybe it's a thing that's going to make you feel alive, which is also bloody worthwhile. So I think, I'm a big fan of really recognizing when you're excited and making sure it counts.
You sort of touched over it there, and I'm going to ask you a question that you may very well tell me that you can't answer. But what's the one that got away? The idea that you had so much excitement for, it felt like lightning in a bottle, and it just kind of fizzled.
See, that's an interesting one. There is one I'll talk about in general terms, because I still reckon it'll happen. There's one idea that is about that was about religion, and I was so excited about it, and we'd pitched it as a TV show, and I think it had gotten quite far with an American company, and then it hit a point where, and I've experienced this a few. We set it up with an American company, and then they hit a point where they were like, they wanted to make a really drastic change to it that was going to kill it. And I made the somewhat difficult decision of, I'd rather we don't do this at all. If we're going to, I had a moment of we either do it right or we don't do it at all.
Yeah.
And that was I think that was sort of on me to go, I don't think it's worth doing it this way because it won't be the thing that it's meant to be. And I don't often make those decisions. Usually I'm like, let's make it work. Let's find a way to mold it until it works. But that's been the only time where I've been like, I don't think this is the right. And it it was precious enough to me that I was happy to kind of let it sit for longer without it turning into something. But I mean, I did spend a good 20 years basically being told you're not famous enough to host that show. And now, I've literally sat in meetings with people and they're like, yeah, no, you're not famous enough to host that show. That's fine. And that's fine. It doesn't bother me at all. Now I'm in this weird position where like I am famous enough to host some things. It means when I do agree to do a thing, whether it's my idea or somebody else's idea, I really have to think about why. Like, why is it worth doing? Not for me, but like, why is it worth existing in the world? And is that a thing that I think the world benefits from? So I spend a lot more time thinking about my why now.
That purpose conversation is something that fascinates me because I believe that purpose fuels progress. Like if there's a real reason, if there's a why behind something, your ability to get it from the point of idea or feeling or something that you're like deeply passionate about to something that actually helps the world, like you have so much more endurance and so much more resilience.
Because it's bigger than you.
Correct.
Like if something has to exist in the world for reasons bigger than I just like it and I want to do it, it powers through those moments where you're told no. It powers through those moments where, it can't be funded or what. I'm talking in general terms because I think it's a principle that works. I'm talking in general terms because I don't want people to think it's just about media or internet. It's a principle that works across all creative endeavors, right? If you think something should exist because it should exist beyond you, it will power you through the harder moments. And it becomes about more than just I want to do this as a job or I want to do it because it makes me feel good. It becomes about something bigger, which is great.
I think it's an incredible thing. It's one of the messages that I want to share with people. It's one of the things I speak about on stage. Like the monumental shift in my life direction off the back of crafting a purpose for myself. Or almost like stumbling into, this thing serves the world and makes me feel more fulfilled than anything I've ever experienced before. Like that was a incredibly shifting experience for me at the age of 24 to find a way that I could actually serve the world better than what I'd ever been able to put my finger on before. And I almost have a thought that I've been toying with at the moment. I don't know if you've seen, but I wrote about it the other day. I don't think many people were interested in it because I wrote like a 7-page Instagram article.
I think I got to page 3.
Okay, yeah. It's my theory around, I think a lot of men in particular lack a sense of purpose in their life right now. And I think I want to change that because I'm deeply invested in how can I help men become the best versions of themselves for societal reasons that we spoke about before, but a bunch of other things. And I was thinking about it in terms of, is endurance sports or endurance running, ultra marathons, whatever you want it to be, and entrepreneurship, the modern man's endurance expedition? Thinking about it in the terms of, if you look back at Ernest Shackleton's endurance expedition, and have you seen that ad? There's some talk that the ad is fictitious, but the ad says something along the lines of men wanted for treacherous journey.
The Shackleton's it's the newspaper ad that Shackleton put. I think it might be fake, but even if it isn't, the principle holds.
The principle holds, right? And so it basically describes all of these fucking horrible circumstances, like low wages, bitter cold, doubtful safe return, but the last line, honour and recognition in the event of success. And the part of the tale is that droves of men arrive at his address in Burlington Street, London, to be a part of this expedition. And I even think about it in terms of how many young men signed up for the adventure of what they thought was going to be this journey, aka a world war, because they wanted something bigger than themselves. They wanted a purpose. And, there's plenty of propaganda and conversation behind that, right? But I think naturally, intrinsically, as human beings, we want something that gets us out of bed and makes us strive forward and move forward against the odds. And, in this day and age, I'm one of them, so I'm not putting shade on these people, but the ultra marathons and the entrepreneurship and the can I build something from this point of being, as we said before, an idea into something that I exist in that as a workplace where I'm passionate and we have these ideas that are bigger than ourselves that we're striving towards. And I honestly think it's the modern man's expedition.
I think there is always going to be a desire to be part of something that is bigger than you. And I think it's fair to say some of that is the reflected glory of the big thing. You know, like that last line in the possibly made up ad, you know, like honor or recognition with success. Like, I think some of it has, by being involved with the big thing, some of that momentousness will be reflected back on me. And that's a slightly cynical take on it. But I also think there's the other end of it, which is perhaps we are collective creatures, right? We don't exist entirely in isolation. And to want to be involved in something bigger than us, a bigger idea, is a recognition that we are not alone. We're not just like ships in the night. We are all connected, and to be part of something big is a reminder that we are a community. I don't know how that, pardon me, I don't know how well that intersects with the ultramarathon. I think it works with run clubs.
It does, yeah.
But I think the underlying principle for me there is that we, as human beings, will always seek community. We will always seek to connect with one another, and to connect and to feel part of something bigger than who we are makes us feel like there is a broader purpose to why we're around.
Yeah, it's so important. What do you think, series-wise, your creation-wise, has had the biggest impact on society?
That's an easy one. Stuff the British Style is it's a podcast and a TV series that has gone all around the world. If you've never heard of it before, it's the weirdest niche idea, and of all the things I've ever made, it blows my mind that it's the thing that's gotten the biggest. In museums and galleries all around the world are a bunch of objects, and a lot of them were basically stolen. But what we do with the show is we go back and we kind of try and tell the story of how those things got there. And in doing so, you kind of get to tell the story of how the world was colonised, the good parts and the bad parts. And sometimes we debunk whether things actually were stolen, but they kind of tell a bigger story. And the origin of it was actually, it kind of started as a joke between me and my old TV co-host. And then I happened to be, we were just joking about like a bunch of stolen shit in museums. And then I happened to be in London at the tail end of 2019, and I caught up with a historian, and she just rattled off a list of objects that were basically, that was stolen, that was stolen. That was a gift, but the guy had a gun pointed at him when he was given the gift, so I'm not sure if it qualifies. And I was like, and I recorded the podcast, and eventually I put it out through the ABC. And I remember it went to like number one in a whole bunch of different countries, and just on the strength of the name,
Yeah.
And I was like, shit, this is a thing. And then Americans really took to the podcast, and then it's become a TV series with the second season's coming out in June. And it's, millions of people have now listened to the podcast and watched the TV show. And I think the thing that I find most interesting about it is that it's, I do all kinds of different things. It's the nichest idea, like random shit in museums. It does not sound like a hit. It does not. Of all the things I make, it does not sound like a hit. But what it is that it's a small doorway into a big world. Teeny tiny forgotten things that you walk past when you're on holidays in London. You don't, where you walk past a museum, you don't think about. You just walk past them. But each one of them has a story. And, by the simple virtue of how big the British Empire was, each one of those objects tells the story of who we are, because we're all from somewhere, right? And I think, and I love unfolding those mysteries. And I think, this one random idea has now sent me to countries all around the world. Like the new series of the TV series, we shot in 11 different countries. It's wild, right? So from this very strange niche idea, it's now sort of come to overtake my life for months on end. But also the thing that matters to me is like I get messages. It's like it's watched by families. It's watched by kids. It's watched by grandparents. It has this weird kind of cut through that works for all different ages, which again, like I couldn't have predicted. It sounds like such a weird niche idea, but it's clearly the biggest. And I think it's because each one of those objects starts off with a small story, but then it unfurls into like stories of wars and, heroes and, and complicated decisions throughout history that have actually shaped all of us. Because at the end of the day, if you can speak English, you've been touched by the British Empire. And it's not always a good thing and not always a bad thing. It's too big to be simply good or bad. It's complicated. And by doing this structure of like small object telling a story, you can actually acknowledge that history is pretty messy. It's not simple, clear-cut, good guys, bad guys. And I think that's been something that people kind of take. Like, it's a spicy title, and Brits are always like, well, when are you going to do the French? I'm like, I'll get there, don't worry. But it's like, it's at the end of the day, we're sitting here on this land because of the British Empire. Yeah. Like, that's the reality of it. And it's a way of exploring whether that, how that impacted our lives. So it's that one's a pretty straightforward answer. It's undeniable. Of all the random things I've done, it's clearly the thing that's become the biggest by far.
Is that what you meant when on Mark Burris's podcast you said history often hides behind politeness?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think museums and galleries are great. I'm a nerd. I love them. But you walk past and they have these little polite plaques. They're like, it was acquired by this person. I'm like, yeah, go on. Tell me how he acquired it.
Yeah.
And it's not unique to the British by any stretch of the imagination. Museums love to they only have like 80 words to explain their stuff, so it's not very much. It's less than a tweet in most cases. They don't have a lot of room to tell the story of how they got there, and sometimes they don't want to. It's changing, but I think you go through museums and galleries and they've got like these little polite plaques and they tell you, we got it in this year, but they don't tell you the story and they don't tell you the characters and they don't tell you who won and who lost and whose life was changed in that moment. That's what I'm interested in. It's the stories. Like, it's the stories that don't get told. And objects are, subject, like museums and galleries to me are just big boxes filled with mysteries. And some people assume that I think every object should be like given back to people. And I'm like, no, not necessarily. But what I do want is just tell the truth. Like, that, honestly, that's all I care about with that show in particular. Just if they could just tell the truth about how things got there, I think that's all people really need. And what happens next is up to everyone else. Like, the Greeks will always want marbles back from Britain, and some people are like fine to have their culture stuff sitting in a museum as an ambassador for them around the world. There's no one size fits all response to this. But I do think on a baseline, just tell the truth and don't be polite about it. Just tell us what really happened.
I love that take because that highly resonates with me, because I often think about this, right? We know more about our history now than we ever have because more stories come to light, more people like yourself tell these stories, and I love that we get to hear and sometimes acknowledge the truth. But I almost feel like there's sometimes the more people understand about history, they grow a distaste for particularly that part of society or that country. I think now, if you ask most people now, and I've seen some videos online, and maybe this is me leaning into my pessimistic side, I've seen some videos
you don't have a pessimistic side.
I'm too optimistic, but it's good. I heard a lot of people on this video where they were asked by this gentleman who was I believe his parents were immigrants, but he was born in Australia. I think he might be Sri Lankan background. Oh, yeah. I forget this guy's name, so apologies to him if he somehow comes across this online. But he was asking people on the street what they thought about Australia, whether they love the country. And I'm sure part of the edit process was to create something that actually sparked a conversation on TikTok. But there was a lot of people who had an absolute distaste and hatred for the country they live in. And they spoke particularly around a very controversial day in Australia right now, Australia Day.
Yeah.
And my family has some Indigenous background. I have friends who are Indigenous. And I think my point of view on this is I've got no problems with changing the date. I'm like, I would just love to be able to celebrate the country together. Like on Gen 26 Australia Day this year, I remember being down the beach. My partner was at work, so I was walking down the beach and I'm looking and I can see some comments online from people who understandably don't feel good about the day. and then I could see some people on the beach playing cricket, and it was a beautiful day and the sun was out, and I was like, I would love to be able to celebrate this amazing country with everybody on this day. But I think sometimes no matter what changes, there'll still be people who have a distaste for the country on whatever day we choose to celebrate it because of its history.
Look, I feel similarly. I think it'd be lovely. Put it this way, I love Australia. Like I was raised here. I know I come from all over the world. Like my mum's from Singapore. My dad was born here, but he's got Irish background. And I like most Australians have come. I'm made up from imported ingredients, like most of us are, right? And I think what has been built in Australia is, by and large, wonderful. I love this place. I think what's interesting is that we need to get to a point where we're grown up enough that we can acknowledge that a whole bunch of awful things happened to get us to this point, and a whole bunch of truly incredible things happened here. I mean, some of the innovations developed on this soil that have shaped the world, right? We should be able... I don't know how it is we've arrived at this weird point in culture where we can't hold two things in our head at once. Like, how is it we've got to the point where we can't be like, there's so many things to be proud of and happy with, and also there's so many awful things which we should acknowledge. They don't cancel each other out. Correct. They don't balance each other out. They simply coexist. And my God, are we not grown-ups? Like, can we not do both things at once? And I think where it gets complicated is like statues and national holidays, because they are designed, you only build statues to heroes, right? And you only set aside public holidays for celebration. I think it would be wonderful if we had, a day upon which we can happily just acknowledge what is good. I think it seems like not controversial to me. And if it happens on a day where it clearly causes an enormous amount of pain to people that have been here for 65,000 years, just personally for me, and I'm not telling people what they should do, personally for me, it doesn't make sense. Like, I just think there's 365 days in the year. We should be able to pick a day that doesn't cause pain. That's my personal feeling. I don't have a lot of opinions in public, but that one I'm just like, guys, like it just seems like a no-brainer to me. But at the same time, just to kind of take a step back and like more broadly about, how we talk about the past. Whenever somebody points out something bad that happens in the past, there's a brigade of people that instantly pop up and go, well, why don't you talk about the good? And then whenever somebody talks about the good of the past, there's a brigade of people that pop up and go, why don't you talk about something bad? And my thing is like, can we not just be grown-ups about this and acknowledge that both things exist? And I think, Stuff the British Stole is an interesting one, because whenever we launch a new series, there's always a person who's like, well, why don't you talk about all the things the British gave us? I'm like, it's actually the same story, right? Through telling the story of things stolen, you also talk about, there's an episode of the new series, the TV series, where we talk about, a British guy stole the seeds that they make rubber from, and he stole it from the Amazon. But by doing that and setting up plantations around the rest of the world, it supersized the rubber industry, helped, the Allies in World War I. Like, the ramifications of that are massive. Does it start with theft? Yes. But does it become something that by proxy we've all benefited from? Also yes. Does that make the original theft okay? No, but it's still a thing that happened. So you can do all of these things at the same time. Like, we're not dumb. I just think that people are smarter than we give them credit for. Well, despite some of the things that people post online, I basically believe that we're smarter than we give people credit for. And we can do both things.
I like your worldview there. I agree with you.
Everyone's smarter than they behave online.
Yeah. Oh, we all have our moments, right? But I genuinely like your viewpoint there of two things can coexist.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really healthy way to look at it.
Yeah, there's always more than one side to the story. Just do both. They don't no one side has to win completely. I mean, unless it's like overwhelmingly. But yeah, like we're grown-ups. We should be able to tell the good and the bad and hold them both in our head at the same time. And if we can't, we've got bigger problems. Like that speaks to broader issues.
Have you watched the series The Gentleman?
I just started.
Okay.
It's my bloody Stairmaster show.
It's brilliant. I loved it. I'm a big Guy Ritchie fan.
Yeah.
Love anything that guy creates. And there's a brilliant moment. I've got another fictitious story for you from, I believe it's fictitious anyways, from that series where, I forget the guy's name, but it's Susie Glass's father. And he's sitting there and he's got a sirloin in front of him. He goes, oh, beautiful cut of meat. And he tells this story about how, I believe it's King Henry VIII, how the actual name for the sirloin come about. And he says that one day King Henry VIII at his banquet had the chef prepare 100 dishes for them to enjoy and share. And the sirloin was so tender and so flavoursome that at the end of the meal, he got up and he knighted it, arise sirloin.
Sirloin. Do you know what? Even if that story is not true, it should be
It's great.
true.
And I'm just thinking maybe it's a series idea. How Steak got that? How Steak's got that name.
I'm obsessed with food stories. I want to go back. I did a couple of my first 2 podcast series were all stories about food. So food's such a great lens to see the world and see the past. I think you're onto something.
I have to ask for you, like, who are the figures, the characters, the people of the past, or maybe even still present that you look to and are inspired by in your field?
There's a few. I mean, I probably look. The big one for me is there was a very famous television interviewer when I was growing up by the name of Andrew Denton, and he did a show called Enough Rope that was quite instructive with how I I approach people. I worked for Andrew for a couple of years, and I learned a lot from that as well. There's a few people that are less well known. The big one for me is there's a Canadian TV host who did an interview show for many years called it was called The Hour, and then it was called George Strombopoulos Tonight, and he is my favourite interviewer. Sorry, Andrew, if you're watching this. No, he is my favourite interviewer. And he did, for a long time, my job was interviewing famous people for a living. And I still love it. I love the challenge of, can you get a genuinely authentic moment with 15 minutes with, Matt Damon or something like that. I love that challenge. But George Strombopoulos is probably the person who I most like. There's certainly like Louis Theroux and Stacey Dooley, but they're not people I grew up watching. They're people I kind of watch as an adult and go, oh, interesting how that works. Interesting how they get those moments out of with people, not out of people, with people. But George Strombopoulos and Denton are probably the ones that in terms of what I do now, they're probably the ones that most shape me. But if you ever go on YouTube and just look up George Strombopoulos' interviews, they're everywhere. He's got a decade's worth of interviews with the biggest names, and not just like famous people, but like really interesting musicians, really interesting authors, people that just have great stories. It was my dream show. Like I watch it. Like, it's like early days of YouTube, so it's like a really low res, and I was like, how amazing would this have been? George Strombopoulos and Denton are probably my ones.
For you personally, like, who do you think has surprised you the most in your years of interviewing people? Who's the person that you spoke about having a moment with? Who's the person that you look back on the moment you had with them and think, that was pretty special?
Jamie Lee Curtis and Mark Ruffalo. It's funny, after much bullying, I finally got myself a TikTok. And I was like, I have nothing to post. So what I did was I went back all over my sort of 11 years of interviewing famous people, and I just went back and rewatched stuff, and I was like pulling out clips. I'm like, this is easy TikTok content. And it forced me to go back and watch my old interviews with people. And there was this moment with Jamie Lee Curtis where she walked in the interview and she was just sort of sizing me up. She was like, with this face of like, are you an idiot? I'm trying to work out if you're an idiot or not. She didn't say that, but that was her face. And we just got into this conversation, and you don't have very long with these people, right? We negotiated that we would have minimum 15 minutes, right? But even that, like, that's not a long time. So you've got to go from hello to deep and meaningful like that for it to work. But I remember we got halfway through this conversation. I think I asked her what she was most proud of. And I said, what in your work are you most proud of? And she almost cut me off. She was like, it's not work. I was like, oh, okay. So what is it? And she's like, do you really want to know? I was like, yes. Getting sober. And suddenly we were in that conversation. I was like, okay. So she'd gone from like, is this guy an idiot, to, okay, I trust him enough that I'm going to tell him this thing. And I remember just thinking, she's driving this. Like, she's behind the wheel of this conversation, not me. And I think it's an important thing for profile interviewing, not for like accountability interviewing, where like a politician or a CEO has got to like answer for their whatever. profile interviewing, where it's about getting to understand what's going on underneath the hood of somebody, when they get in charge, when they are driving it, sometimes it can be amazing because they've decided in that moment that they are free enough and safe enough that they're going to share a thing with you. The other one was Marc Ruffalo. Marc Ruffalo had, he nearly died, and it's an incredible story. There was just this turning point where you go from like, let's talk about being the Hulk to tell me about the time you died. And it was a turning point where you can see in their eyes whether they're going to go there or not. And sometimes people don't, and that's okay, and you just move on. And I've learnt my lesson. No one ever wants to be treated like a performing monkey. Like when you're in a conversation, people want to be, you've always got to ask yourself the question as an interviewer, why did they agree to do this? What do they want out of it? How do they want to be seen? Doesn't necessarily mean that you give them that. Sometimes people want to be seen as smart or an expert or funny. You don't always have to give them that, but if you understand why they want what they want, you can create an environment where they feel safe enough and heard enough and acknowledged enough that they will also be open and vulnerable with you. Which you do really well, by the way. So I think, I did it for, I think, 11 years, and I really enjoyed it. But I do think it's a really particular challenge, and I love that moment where it's two people in a room. Yes, there's cameras and mics and all of that, but that person has made a decision that they're going to be honest with you. And it's a thoroughly authentic moment that only two people in the world could have had. I still find that exciting. Still do.
I really like that take on it. That only two people in the world could have had but maybe that's only particularly true when you get comfortable with being yourself in that setting. Yeah,
you have to be comfortable. But you also do interesting things. Oh, I found I did interesting because I would always edit those. I edited almost all of them. And which is rare. I realise now lots of TV presenters don't do that, but because I came up through a culture where you do everything yourself. So I still do a lot of it. And I would realise watching back the footage that I would do really strange things. Like when somebody went really big and they're using their hands and they're talking like this, I would match their physicality, right? But when they got really, small and intimate, I would almost shrink. And, I'd get really small. And it's almost like you'd match their body language.
Yeah, mirroring.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm doing it... Sorry, I'm hitting the microphone. I'm doing it instinctively, but of course there is a bunch of psychology behind it. Also, I've also realised, I'm built like a brick shit. I'm not very tall, but I'm wide and I'm thick. So when I crouch into a ball, I just look like a ball. I don't get small. I just look like somebody's rolled him up into a small boulder. And I'd watch back this footage and I'd see the camera go tilting down. It's like, why does Marc look like he's in a fetal position? It's like, I'm trying to create a safe space for people to share their deepest, darkest. You just look like you're in a fetal position like a massive weirdo.
To pivot here, but to use your segue of mentioning being built like a brick shit house, one of my favourite things that I've ever seen on your Instagram is there was a photo of you and I think you were in the gym and somebody commented, I don't know who it was and I'll butcher the comment, but it was something along the lines of, I'd love a page dedicated to your biceps.
It's funny with gym content because I don't do it very often, but my trainer, he's got a camera and he's got a good sense of good angles, and initially I asked him to take some photos because I had to do something for publicity for some health and fitness thing, and I was like, and they didn't end up using the pictures. I was a bit like, well, I've got these pictures and it's like, you've got your pump-ons. I was like, oh yeah, you don't look bad. I remember posting it and it just being like, and I hadn't posted anything in the gym ages because I've got two small kids. I'm not thin. I'm never I'm a chunky boy, but I'm also strong, right? So yeah. I'm never going I'm not. Anyway, I remember just posting it, just being like, I'll see how it goes, and it still weirds me out how much people love gym content. Yeah. I'm like, ooh, that's addictive. But I'm also I also only look good from very specific angles.
Do you think has it got something to do with the intrigue of people like you? I would say that it's typically not the content you post, and so it's almost like you're an undercover gym bro.
I absolutely am an undercover gym bro. It's it's funny that you say that because my job is, I guess it's viewed as a bit intellectual. I don't know. I have a very there's like work Mark where it's like, you know, questions and curiosity and, you know, nerdiness. And then there's like, I'm also a gym bro on the side. And I'm really, I mostly just, I consume a lot of like gym bro content.
Yeah.
And I think people don't, I don't know, like you're right. It's not a common, yeah, it is. It's like maybe people view it as inconsistent. Like maybe not inconsistent. Maybe people don't expect it. That there's the really nerdy part of my life, and then there's like lifting part of my life.
Bit of range. I like it.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't got to the point where I'm like posting like Strava screenshots or anything like that. Because mostly because I can't fucking run.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah, that's literally why I said it. No, because I can't run. I'm so bad at it. I'm like, give me a treadmill any day. Give me that low impact cardio.
It's so funny though, because a mate of mine, he's a journalist at Sporting News Australia, Jed Wells, and he was talking to him about who I got coming on the pod, and I mentioned you, and he goes, "Hold on, when did he get so fucking swole?" And like maybe it's just people didn't know.
No,
that was part of your life.
No, people. Years ago, before I had kids, it's funny. Like I got a new Fitbit the other day, and it remembered. I got a new Fitbit, and because you set up an account, right?
Yeah.
It remembers all your old. You know, I was like, yeah. It remembered how much I weighed before we had kids. Yeah. I was like, shit. I've been going. This sounds really stupid to say, but I've been into like training and gyms since I finished high school. The thing is, I've never been thin, right? So I've always been chunky. Like, and I was a fat kid growing up. I always have been. And my body kind of expands and contracts like everyone's does, but it expands and contracts pretty drastically. And it's what's interesting about, I guess, my job being having made so much TV and a lot of it just existing on YouTube forever, is I can literally watch like interviews with people, and I can tell you the year based on just the shape of my face.
Yeah,
it's like 2018 was a fat year, 2019 was a thin year, 2020 started off as a thin year, and then that pandemic happened and it became a fat year. You know, like, and I think as a person who, you know, grew up fat, and I don't know how else to describe it. Like, if you grow up as a fat kid and you deal with that as a kid, it becomes part of your personality. I can be swole, I can be, you know, I can weigh in the 80s or in the 100s. It doesn't matter. I will always view myself as a fat kid. You don't lose it. You just don't lose it. And yeah, but you know, like it kind of stays with you. That sense of mentality stays with you forever, and you don't quite lose it. And it's hard to explain to people unless they've been that way too. Even people that have like completely changed their body and, you know, have like, you know, bulging veins and stuff like that. There's a thing in your brain that if you went through fat kid bullying as a kid, you don't ever quite lose it. But yeah, no, to come back, I've been in gyms since I was a teenager. I've always, I love a good late night gym. Like they're among my favorite places. Like a gym at night, because they're too fucking busy these days.
They're crazy busy.
Oh my God, it's mental. But like I go at like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and I love just a big empty gym. They're my favourite. I'm very bro-y in that regard.
How much do you think the exercise helps your mental state and like your ability to think and explore these ideas?
Heaps. I don't mind walking. I don't mind other things. I've done other things. I did a few years of like F45 and things like that. And no judgment. Like there's so many different ways people can be fit now, and there's no one size fits all. My brain, the two non-work things that calm my brain, there are two. One is cooking, and it doesn't have to be like glamorous like Instagram cooking. It's just the action of cooking. And the other thing is like lifting heavy shit. I just love lifting heavy shit. And just the gradual progression of it. Like it doesn't, you know, whether or not that muscle shows or not is in some ways less interesting to me than just like, can I add 2 kilos? Can I add 5 kilos a week on like that? Like just, I like the mechanicalness of it. I don't know, like it calms my brain in a way that other kinds of Like, I played a lot of team sports in high school and I was really bad at them. Like, I'm uncoordinated. Like, I'm fully uncoordinated. I was the worst left back in the history of Year 8 soccer. Like, I was really bad. Just bad because I've got a feature film that we've made about a soccer team that's coming out in a month. And I realised, like, team sports just stressed me out because I knew I wasn't good at most of them. But I also knew that the nature of team sport is that other people are relying on you. And if you know you're not good at this and everyone else knows you're not good at this, that is a recipe for bad. I know people can have good experiences with it and they can get better. I did not have a good experience with it. I was all right. Like, I didn't mind, like, the various forms of rugby when I was early teenager because I just like smashing into people. But that's not the fullness of that game. And
especially early tteenager. When some kids haven't developed yet, and you're the thick guy, you're gonna have some fun with that.
Yeah, it was like a combination of uncoordinated, didn't really know what it was doing, didn't understand the rules. Also, wasn't raised with sport. Like, that's the other thing. Like, it's such a huge part of Australian culture, right? It's so built into the Australian psyche. But neither of my parents were into it. So I'm at, like, this sport mad school where everybody knows, you know, what team's playing, and I'm just like, what the fuck is that?
Has that changed for you though?
No, it has. I'm still like, I've never been. It's weird. Like, as a person that, like, loves gyms, loves training, I've never been into sport. But I just finished making a film about a football team, and I've sort of had to learn, which is good. Like, this is the point earlier. Like, I have to learn. No, it's still a weird thing that it's weird to be a person in Australian media that knows fuck all about sport because like, that's the thing. Everyone does. Yeah. And I don't. And it's not that I'm like, I think I'm above it or some shit like that. It's just I wasn't raised with it. And you think about how much sport underpins Australian culture, right? If you weren't raised with it and you don't know, you know, who the teams are and the difference between NRL and AFL and fuck, like, if you don't know, it's a massive, you really struggle socially in a lot of different contexts. Like, I remember when I first started working, I was working in Melbourne at a commercial TV channel, and before I went down there, a mate of mine, he's like, okay, look, before you go there, you go for the Cats. I'm like, do I? He's like, yeah, no, you go for the Cats because I go for the Cats. It's like, just if it because you can't be in Melbourne without a team, so if it comes up, you go for the Cats. I'm like, cool. And I was working at Channel 10, and I casually said Geelong Cats, and it was Peter Hellier and Waleed Ali, who both looked at, or maybe Tommy, they looked at me and went, no. You either say Geelong or you say Cats. Cats, yeah. You don't say both. And at that moment, I was like, you guys know I don't know what I'm talking about, right? No, it's very obvious you don't know what you're talking about. And that was when I was like, I should stop. I can't fake my way into this. Yeah. Like, respect, like, nothing but respect, but I cannot fake my way into this. So I'm just going to be upfront from you on people that I know fuck all about this and just be open with it. Like, I'm clearly not against health and fitness, but I'm also just like, I wasn't raised with this and I don't know what I'm talking about and I'm not going to pretend. Yeah.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? Where I think I grew up on sport, loved sport, would watch anything.
Yeah, right.
Like, loved rugby league. Like, it was when I was 6, I wanted to be Brad Fittler. That was my goal in life. And then Brad Fittler or Batman. And then
they could be the same. I've never seen them in the room together, right?
That is a fair point. And then it was like, I loved cricket in summer, but I just loved any sport growing up. Like, the opportunity to watch sport, the Olympics comes around, I'm sitting up till late at night. As I've gotten older and I've become, like, really passionate about a few things and I feel like I have less spare time than ever, I watch way less sport.
Have you triaged? Have you been like, no, I will watch NRL, I will watch, like, have you picked ones that you will choose to care about?
If it's live.
Okay.
Like, I love NRL because I grew up on it and two of my best mates play in the NRL, and so, like, there's an interest there every week. They don't play for the team that I go for. Sorry, lads.
Traitors.
Yeah.
Are they even really your friend?
You know, it's questionable. But to be fair, I've become friends with them once their careers were very much solidified. So it's I can't make them change. But, you know, it's like, if it's live, I'm just happy to go and watch anything because it's an enjoyable experience. Yeah. But I really just, like, I'll put the chooks on because I'm a Roosters fan and I'll watch the boys play when they're playing. And then outside of that, I'm like, if I miss it, I don't really care. Yeah. I just think because I've got interest in other things, And I just don't have, like, I would prefer to sit up and watch something that makes sense for me to watch for my work. Like, I would prefer to sit up and watch a series that, like, gives me some good ideas, or even sometimes something that just allows me to switch off and have no emotion towards it at all. Like, at the moment, I feel like every couple's always got, like, an easy watch, and at the moment, ours is The Mentalist.
Yeah, the one that you both agree on?
Yeah.
Because you both have your individual shows, and then there's, like,
Correct.
the agreeable list. Yeah. It's hard, you know? And then if one of you goes away and the other one wants to watch the show, that's
It's a difficult dance,
Yeah,
it's a difficult dance. But
you try the synchronized watch. It doesn't really work.
well, we find there's always got to be a show that, like, if you miss an episode or you miss 10 minutes of it, it doesn't really change the viewing experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair enough. We do Abbott Elementary, like, which is this, it's a sitcom set in a school. It's on Disney+. It's the easiest watch in the world. And it's really funny, but it's like you can go away for 5 minutes and you did not miss a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. The last thing I want to ask you, Mark, is, like, private life. I've heard you speak about it before, that you choose to keep your kids off the grid.
Yep.
Do you think we really have a private life now?
Yeah, no, I think we do. I think, look, I think my kids are at an age where in a couple of years they're going to have their own social media presence, and for me, because I'm reasonably well known, I want to create a buffer, basically a couple of years worth of buffer where, you know, obviously when they were babies, we posted pictures and stuff like that, and I'm not going to go back into my grid and delete shit, right? But because it's time that I don't have, but I wanted to, I did very intentionally just wanted to initially to create a buffer for them to have their own online space where there wasn't like a bunch of pictures and videos of them on my stuff that then comes to colour what they want to do. But then also, it actually a bigger issue was I actually just realised I wanted my online presence. It was more about me going, I actually just want my online presence to be exclusively really like stuff that I work on or like, you know, really controlled like how much of my life I want to share. So I don't put much, and, you know, like, I don't put much of my generalised family life on there because I think I just want to keep that in its own world. To the point that I think sometimes my wife is slightly offended that I don't post pictures. And I'm like, it's just like, I just want to keep it as a space where I don't want to open up a conversation about where my family life, my family life lives somewhere else and it doesn't need to be online. You know, I guess I blur it with the gym selfies, I suppose, but yeah, I just wanted to create a buffer zone for that space. And you get the audience you cultivate, right? You get the audience you cultivate. And I think for me, I felt like it was, it made my non-work life clearer if it was not an online thing. But even on sort of political issues and things like that, like, first and foremost, I'm a journalist who works for the two major public broadcasters, the two public broadcasters in Australia. Firstly, you're not really allowed to have an opinion. You need to be seen as unbiased, right? So for that alone means I'm not going to be posting about a bunch of events, even though I have very strong thoughts and feelings on a whole bunch of issues. I don't post about those things. I will only post when it comes to like news and current affairs. I will only post about stories that I personally have covered and I know about, right? So things where I've been there and I know and I understand the context. I won't share too many other articles and things like that because I don't know the context around it, and it's better for it's better that stuff moves without me muddying the waters with an endorsement. If it's a story I've covered in depth, I'll share about it. And sometimes that is really unpopular, like around big events like, you know, current wars and things like that. I definitely have an opinion about, you know, how that's playing out and where fault lies. But it's not, at the end of the day, I'm not helping that situation by throwing out my random opinions. I do other things, but I think what matters to me is it is my job to be able to step into any room in the world and for people and to create an environment where people feel comfortable sharing with me their thoughts, their feelings, their opinions. If I am constantly throwing out my thoughts, feelings, and opinions on stuff everywhere, I'm throwing baggage out in the world. And it damages my ability to step into a room. If people see you coming and they already know what you think, they have a preconception about you that shapes how they will be open with you. I want to create an environment where anybody will talk to me because that's my job, right? Is it frustrating sometimes to not post about things that I think are really atrocious and need attention? Yes, it absolutely is. But most of those things aren't going to be changed by me posting about them. And in fact, they're actually going to damage my ability to make other changes later down the track. This is a rule for me. I don't think this is a rule that should be adopted for everyone. For me, it is important that when I open the door, when I sit down in front of people, that they don't have some preconception about what I think about them. I want people who massively disagree with me or people who agree with me to know that they will get a fair hearing when I sit down in front of them. That's really important to me, and it should be important to all journalists. Different people have different approaches to it, and I respect those approaches. Some people are much more forthright with their opinions, and they're knowledgeable and they're informed, and I respect it. It's a different approach. That's just the one that I've taken. And so as a result, my online profile, it is very much about the stuff that I make, and the odd gym selfie. I don't know, like I really muddy the water with the gym selfies, but yeah, like I think it's, look, there's been a criticism of social media, particularly Instagram, as being like a curated version of yourself, and like maybe that gives an unrealistic picture of someone's life. That's okay. It is okay for you to your online profile, online perception of you does not have to be a one-to-one recreation of the entirety of who you are. It is okay for you to have agency and curate which parts of you are open for public and which aren't. That is a choice that everybody, when you sign up, gets to make, and that's fine. I think that's okay. I don't think you're being misleading. I think the act of curating your social media is not, misleading, or like, it's a choice and yours to make. You get to decide how the world sees you. Every time you put something online, it is up to you to decide how you want the world to see you, and that is your choice.
Couldn't agree with you more.
So I guess I'm posting more gym selfies then, is what I'm hearing from you.
Well, I think if you spend 8 hours a day on social media, you start to believe that the world is what social media tells you it is. But if you are out there existing in the world, you see that everyone has different parts of themselves that they're willing to share, other parts they like to keep private. I agree with you that I think just because you share the highlights of your life doesn't mean you need to share the hard points or the points of adversity. It's not for everyone to see, and that's for you to decide.
Yeah.
And not everyone needs to share their opinion on everything. Yeah.
Sold.
Very healthy way to look at it. Hey, mate.
I hope so.
Oh, I think it is. And I tend to, from our conversation today, I really like the way that you see the world. It's no surprise to me that you have very fair views on things, considering the fact that you lead with curiosity and you're willing to hear what the world has to say about different topics and different experiences. And, mate, I've really enjoyed this. I've enjoyed hearing what you have to say. I'm sure that everyone listening will. And for all of the listeners, I'll make sure that everywhere they can find you is in the show notes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed this. Thank you for doing it.
My pleasure. Cheers.